partners. I'm old enough to remember the Great Depression. I'm sure that a lot of young people today have no idea about the dire straits this nation and much of the world was in the early 1930s. My researcher and writer, Dennis Daly, didn't live through that horrible era in American history, but he is a historian. And this time around, he brings us the story of a man who nearly single-handedly kept millions of Americans smiling during the darkest days of those 1930s. This week's honoree is the best example of an ordinary man who rose to worldwide popularity. His dad was one of the chiefs of the Cherokee Indian Nation. He was born in Oklahoma, back when that part of the West was known as Indian Territory. Before his life was over, this humble guy appeared in more than 70 movies, many in the silent film times, we call it the silent era. He became a popular early radio star, and he sit down for this. During his lifetime, he wrote more than 4,000 newspaper columns. If you're old enough, you probably guessed his name. This week, we're going to profile Will Rogers. Oh, and I forgot something. The first real talent for which young Will Rogers was recognized was his amazing ability with a lasso. You know, a cowboy rope. Some call it a lariat. His first job was with a traveling circus. He did his rope tricks. Then on a chance, he went to New York City. Back then, one of the biggest shows on Broadway was the Ziegfeld Follies. Oh, I remember people talking about the Ziegfeld Follies. Will Rogers made this long trip from the dusty roads of Oklahoma to New York City, and he auditioned for the show. He was quickly hired to do a roping act on stage. Audiences stood and cheered. Everyone had heard about the Old West and the rope-slinging cowboys, but no one in Manhattan had ever seen one. That is, until they saw Will Rogers on stage. Partners, the story goes that one night there was problems with the curtains in the theater. The stage manager said, Will, stay on the stage out there and keep roping. But Will knew that if he just did his rope tricks and nothing else, people would get tired of that real quickly. So he stopped roping and made some comments about the news of the day. His style was homespun and interesting. His comments were right on the mark. Soon he was being told to drop all of his rope tricks. No, I just said that. Soon to drop some of his rope tricks and talk to the audience more and more about politics and the news of the day. Soon, early radio picked up Will Rogers, giving him time on the air. No rope tricks on the air for Will, no. All he was doing now was giving homespun humor and commentary. Did it work? Did it? He became a hit almost overnight. Many of the things he was saying on radio soon became familiar around the nation. I want to give you a couple of his quotes that were famous phrases. On one radio show, Will Rogers said, "I'm not a member of an organized political party. I'm a Democrat." God bless him. I can see him right now. He also told his audience, and I'm quoting him now, "I don't make jokes. I just watch the government and report the facts." Then Hollywood called him. He went west and starred in a series of silent movies. He later made talkies, that's what we called them, regular movies. The films all showed off his roping skills, but they also had plots. And as you can guess, Will Rogers was always the good guy in the white hat. Now here's something that is really strange, but wonderful. Not all that strange. He became good friends with Franklin Delano Roosevelt before FDR was president. At one of Roosevelt's parties, Will Rogers went to the microphone and referred to FDR as Frank. He then blushed and said, "Well, I'm sure one of these days I'm going to have to start calling him Mr. President. But for now, he's Frank, as far as I'm concerned." FDR laughed so hard he nearly fainted. Historians say that times that Rogers and Roosevelt appeared together did a lot to tell Americans that although FDR came from a very wealthy background, he was still a friend of the common man and loved homespun humor. Partners, in the early 1930s, as the Depression got worse, Will Rogers knew that the nation needed a comical shot in the arm. He made more and more appearances on radio and appeared in many more movies, and every day he published his nationwide newspaper column. It was during this time that Will Rogers fell in love with aviation. He was a strong advocate of better and safer airplanes. He'd tell his listeners that someday airline travel would become commonplace, just like taking the bus, he once said. He could predict his future, but the future happened later than Rogers hoped. He was in the air so much that many of his press dubbed him America's flying goodwill ambassador. They didn't know where he was going next. He was always in the air, like I said. It was at this point that a nationwide poll noted that Will Rogers, this guy from Oklahoma that used a rope to do tricks on stage, was the most loved and most trusted person in America. He even beat out Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Will Rogers began flying around the nation, bringing his message of common sense and patriotism to all points of the country. You talk about personal appearances, man, he was there everywhere. He also made friends with one of the best-known pilots of that time, Wiley Post. Now, partners, before bringing you the end of the Will Rogers story, I want to give you another quote. When Calvin Coolidge, a man known for being so quiet that many called him Silent Cal, was elected president, Will Rogers told his audiences that seeing Calvin Coolidge in the White House was like seeing a little 2-year-old baby with a hammer. He said, you know you're going to get the hammer back eventually, but you don't know how much damage he's going to do in the meantime. What a guy. But friends, there's a sad and sudden end to the Will Rogers story. I told you he had become friends with legendary pilot Wiley Post. Well, in late 1935, the United States Postal Service asked Wiley Post to see if he could find an airmail route to Russia. They suggested a route would be across Alaska and into Russia the back way. Will Rogers was so excited about this, he asked Wiley Post if he could go along. Well, certainly, he said, yes, glad to have you. All went well until they were leaving Point Barrow, the northernmost point in Alaska. The Winnie Mae nosed over. Both men died in that accident. The world mourned. FDR issued a statement, but in spite of his death, the legacy of Will Rogers lives on. Every time a commentator jokes about someone in politics, Will Rogers is there. Every time the late commentator Paul Harvey used humor to present the news, a little bit of Will Rogers was with him. And if you remember the late radio and TV personality Herb Schreiner, you may remember that he was called the new Will Rogers. Will Rogers made us laugh. He made us laugh at a time we really needed to laugh. He showed Americans that they could talk about their national leaders with a sense of humor. He made America laugh during the darkest days of the Depression, and he died far too young. He was only 55. Partners, oh, I can still remember him when he came to Chickasha with Wiley Post. Well, no, that was true, but I mean, Wiley Post and Harold Getty went around the world in the Winnie Mae, and they came to Chickasha. I'll never forget, it was such a big thing for us. Will Rogers, a man loved. He will always be loved. Well, it's time to go on back now. Thanks, Dennis, for bringing us this story of Will Rogers. I'll never forget him as a little boy. I can still see him there in Chickasha. Okay, that's enough. You know the drill now. Let's get back. You'll find some little squares up there, and one of them has an X in it. That's the one you just click now, and it'll take you right back to your report page. I've loved doing this thing about Will Rogers, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I love you.